Let's now take a minute to talk about what happens with hip-hop in the 1990s. Starting out by saying we can really only give a quick summary or survey of some of the things that were happening in hip-hop in the 1990s. There is a whole course that could be done on the history of hip-hop music. I have to say that when I was teaching years ago, teaching this course maybe 10 years ago, I would often say, I thought that hip-hop would become such an entity in and of itself that we would start not talking about it in history of rock courses because it was so clearly its own style, and why should we talk about hip-hop any more than we should talk about jazz or country and western, which we largely ignore when we talk about the history of rock. But the two styles, hip-hop and rock and roll, have stayed pretty close. It's kind of difficult to talk about hip-hop without talking about rock, and it's hard to talk about rock without talking about hip-hop. So let's talk about it a little bit now. If you remember our story from the last time we were talking about hip-hop and rap, we talked about how it arose from in the 80s from a kind of underground scene that actually began in the late 1970s and eventually over the course of the decade became increasingly mainstream with the help of tracks like Run DMC's Walk This Way, which really, Rick Rubin, whose name keeps popping up again and again, Rick Rubin sort of got this idea that you could appeal, you could have the kind of crossover appeal to white listeners and viewers of MTV by incorporating more of the guitar, the electric guitar kind of thing. And so you see Aerosmith getting together with Run DMC and really sort of launching in many ways rap music on MTV and in white rock culture. Well, it gets bigger and bigger. By the end of the 80s, rap is clearly a force to be reckoned with. And what often happens, really just as a matter of musical stylistic kind of consequence of all this, and as a kind of marketing consequence of all this, is as there is more money to be made, there is the incentive to try to find your niche, to separate yourself out from the others, to create a kind of brand. So when we think about this musically, we think about styles sort of splitting off and becoming specialties, so you get more sub-styles. We talked about that happening at the beginning of the 1970s. At the beginning of this course. And now we're starting to see that happening increasingly with hip-hop, that there are a number of different kinds of styles. Of course, from a marketing perspective, if there's lots of money to be made, you want to be able to, you don't want to have, just any number of versions of the same thing. You want to create different kinds of things to appeal to people in different kinds of ways. So you can see why it happens. Another thing that starts to happen in hip-hop that's really important during this decade is the increased technology that comes with digital sampling. We'll talk in just a minute in the next lecture about the rise of digital technology and recording and how important that was. In the 80s, it leads to the CD and then to various kinds of digital recorders. Well, now rap artists could start sampling things digitally. So rather than having to sort of pull an analog style off of a record, they could actually do some pretty sophisticated and interesting kind of digital kinds of things. What that leads to, as more and more of these songs are sampled more and more heavily, is a real kind of fight over who owns the copyright to this. And so you get a lot of issues that have to do with copyright infringement and legal wrangling over copyright. That's certainly an issue that goes on. If we talk about hip-hop in the 1990s, we probably should start with this seeming feud between New York and LA hip-hop artists. On the West Coast, we've got Death Row Records, owned and developed by Suge Knight. Maybe the big representative record from the West Coast sound is an album from 1993 called The Chronic, a #3 album on the pop charts, #1 on the black pop charts, featuring Dr. Dre, who had been a member of the group NWA, and also featuring rapper Snoop Doggy Dogg, his sort of first big break in the world of entertainment. The tune "Ain't Nothing But a G String" or "Ain't Nothing But a G Thang" is a #2 hit on the pop charts, #1 on the R&B charts, and it's a great example of sort of sophisticated kind of back and forth kind of rapping between Snoop Doggy Dogg and Dr. Dre, and some interesting kinds of, Dr. Dre is often thought of as a real sort of master of putting together these kinds of rap textures, and so that's a really good example of what's happening with the West Coast sound. On the East Coast, well, on the West Coast we had Suge Knight running Death Row Records. On the East Coast we've got Sean Combs forming Bad Boy Records. Sean Combs had been in the business before this and decided he would start his own company, known variously not only as Sean Combs, but as Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, or simply Diddy. This guy really becomes an important moving kind of force in the East Coast sound. Maybe one of the big representative albums for this branch of hip hop in the 90s is an album by Notorious B.I.G. or Biggie Smalls called Ready to Die from 1995, a number 15 on the pop charts, number 3 on the black pop charts. But the big one was an album called Life After Death from 1997, number 1 on the pop and black charts in 1997. But unfortunately, Biggie Smalls was killed in Los Angeles in 1997, the victim of a drive-by shooting. And this event really gave rise to a continuing idea that these rappers were they were more like the characters they play than in real life than we might have thought, and there were actually sort of assassinations going on between East and West Coast. I think most of that has been, people have figured out that that didn't quite really go down exactly that way, but it made for great press, and so these kinds of things were sort of hyped up, maybe not necessarily by the rap artists themselves, but by the press surrounding it. Another East Coast group we should mention, because their approach to the music is so inventive, is Wu-Tang Clan, proudly from Staten Island in New York. It's a collective of 9 DJs, and here was the idea. This collective of 9 DJs would get together and they would produce a hit album that would kind of launch everybody's career. So everybody sort of pull together and make this big album, and once the album hits, then we'll all sort of split off into our own sort of projects, and we'll use the success from the album as a kind of springboard. So they bring out an album in 1993 called Enter the Wu-Tang, in parentheses, 36 Chambers, but that's not really the one that does it. It gets to number 41 on the pop charts, number 8 in the black charts, but then in 1997 they get Wu-Tang Forever, and that one is number 1 everywhere, the pop charts, the black charts, the UK charts. And really, it does launch the careers of the individual members of the Wu-Tang Clan and their individual success. In years since, it's gotten so big that there's just been the members of Wu-Tang Clan that have gone on to have success. They've also developed categories of associates and affiliates, that is, artists they produce and artists that they financially support or underwrite the cost of their recording and stuff, become kind of an interesting kind of collective or co-op of artists all sort of clustered there from the East Coast. Another artist that has tremendous influence at the end of the 90s and into the first decade of the 21st century is Eminem, coming out of Detroit, Michigan, famously raised on 8 Mile Road, or close to 8 Mile Road in Detroit, if you know the movie. Born as Marshall Mathers, Eminem, a white rapper, and that's maybe a little bit outside the norm. Can white guys really sort of be taken totally seriously inside the world of hip-hop music? He won a 1997 freestyle rap competition in LA, and as the result of winning that competition, Dr. Dre heard his tape and was very impressed, although, as the story goes, he was kind of surprised that Eminem was white. So he produces the album, the Slim Shady LP from 1999. That album is number 2 in the pop charts, number 1 in the black charts, number 12 in the UK. It's the second album for Eminem, and it's interesting because Eminem adopts a persona in that album. We've talked about this throughout the history of rock, going back to the Beatles becoming Sgt. Pepper, Jim Morrison as the Lizard King, Alice Cooper becomes the character Alice Cooper, David Bowie becomes Ziggy Stardust, and so there's a long history there. So Eminem in this album becomes Slim Shady, and Slim Shady is angry, and so all of the lyrics and stuff on that album are all about his anger and frustration, his lashing out, and his aggressive kinds of attitudes. It's not supposed to be Eminem, it's supposed to be Slim Shady. The album, the Marshall Mathers LP, couldn't have been much bigger during the year 2000, number 1 on the pop charts, the black charts, the UK charts, but provoked widespread controversy. Eminem being, again, a famous bad boy who knows just how to get a reaction. And a lot of his albums were criticized by people who thought what he was doing was outrageous, but he was also defended by a lot of people who saw the intelligence and the creativity in what he was doing. I mean, as unlikely an ally as Elton John coming to the defense of Eminem saying, hey, no, man, this guy is great. What he's doing is really, really interesting. So there are always two sides to these stories. A couple of other groups that we should talk about as we talk about hip-hop in the 1990s, just very, very quickly. The Beastie Boys continue in their Beastie Boys ways with a big album in 1998 called Hello Nasty. We begin to see that the band matures from a kind of bunch of rowdy fraternity guys, you know, into a kind of socially conscious, more socially conscious kind of group, even at some points advocating for Eastern religion. De La Soul, an album in 2000 called Artificial Intelligence, Mosaic Thump, which is notable for its positive and introspective lyrics, in many ways sort of going against what is often seen as the kind of negative and maybe destructive lyrics that are found in a lot of hip-hop. Here's something that's very positive and introspective in that way. And then the Fugees, led by a couple of Haitian rappers, Wyclef Jean and Pras Michel, and then also Lauryn Hill in that group, blending rapping with singing. They're not the only ones to do that, but they sort of made that part of what their sort of trademark sound. Their 1996 album, #1 in the pop charts, #1 in the black charts, #2 in the UK charts, called The Score, features their version of their cover version of a Roberta Flack song called Killing Me Softly, which went to #2 in the pop charts, #1 in the black charts, and #1 in the UK. Lauryn Hill coming out of that group, and in 1998 releasing an album that just took the world by storm and was for a while there thought of as, the great album of the year. That album called The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, #1 in both the pop and black charts, #2 in the UK. Powered in part by the single Doo-Wop, That Thing, a #1 hit for Lauryn Hill. Well, having now surveyed the scene with regard to hip-hop in the 1990s, I want to talk in the next video about something that happens in the 1990s that really affects why it is we're here, why it is we're doing a course like that. That is the invention of classic rock. That's what we'll talk about in the next video.